Once in a while, this show really tapped into something you might find interesting.
Tonight.
And I think that Satan plays that role in our lives as well. Not the only force that is important in spiritual growth, but I believe an important one.
There's a hierarchy in nature where the highest member of the lowest species regularly meets the lowest member of the next highest species. Why do they when you get to intellectual beings, beings that are free, is it necessary to stop at humans? Why couldn't you take the next step and say there are also these spiritual beings?
Right at this moment, in the unseen world, beyond our dimension, a war is being played out between both the holy angelic host and the fallen, a war for the souls of the race of man.
It's no secret that for many, the devil is considered to be the very personification of evil, and the archangel Michael considered to be the hero of heaven, the very commander of God's own army. Now, what is piquing the interest of scholars all over the world is the possibility that Lucifer was more than just God's child. Perhaps he was intimately related to Jesus and to the archangel Michael. Now, we are about to embark on a bit of a journey, a detective's trail, to determine whether or not Lucifer could be the brother of the archangel Michael. As life happens around us, the daily routine, the predictable path, all relatively peaceful, and in the grand scheme, these are minuscule moments. We all have been witness to these times, and we have all been participants. Now, imagine a war going on. Not a war of guns and heavy machinery or planes and rockets, but an invisible war fought by two very controversial icons. Tradition tells us that Archangel Michael and Lucifer began their lives as the closest of angelic friends. Yet, like the classic tale of brother against brother, a great rift was opened between them, and their terrible conflict began. It is a war depicted in iconography. It is a war spoken about in religious sermons. It is a war where the spoils of victory are the very souls of mankind. I needed some educated answers. On my first stop, I spent some time with Father Chris Bazuras of St. Albert the Great Church in Los Angeles, California. Father Chris, for centuries, there's been a very lively debate about the possibility that Lucifer and the Archangel Michael were brothers. What's the Church's official stance on this?
The word brother connotes a relationship that denotes something that was used for tribal relations, that to identify family members by a bloodline, which angels as spiritual beings do not have. They don't have blood or generate in that way. However, one could look at all the spirits that were created by God were meant to serve him, and so are united in the purpose of serving God, whatever he designates or asks them to do. And so in a sense, Michael and Lucifer were engaged in that work. But we get the sense that, when we look at the idea of brothers, that their conflict is even greater because of there's a depth to their relationship, that somehow there was a deeper than rather just being co-workers or being, oh yeah, I know that guy down the street. That there's something very deep and profound in the relationship of all these spirits that are serving the Lord.
What about the relationship between Lucifer and the Archangel Michael? What's the current Church's stance on this?
Both are spiritual beings. In Scripture, we have reference to Lucifer being one of the angels that fell. So we know that Lucifer was created by God, as Michael was as well. And at some point, Lucifer chose to be away from God, and so fell from that position, from that presence. But Michael remained faithful. And so Michael continues to serve God's will, whereas Lucifer serves his own. When one turns away from God, then they separate themselves from that relationship. But not just the relationship with God, but with everything else. So if I were to do something wrong, commit some sort of sin, I'm not just sinning against God, but I'm breaking my relationship with all of my brothers and sisters. And so perhaps that's part of that interplay where Lucifer doesn't want anybody else to be connected to God. Lucifer doesn't want anybody to return to relationship with God, as he cannot.
And he's willing to pull the whole house down with him.
Willing to pull the whole house down with him.
This tradition of brother fighting against brother is as old as time itself. History is virtually filled with cases of brothers struggling against each other.
Well, you know, if you think about it, if Michael and Lucifer are mentioned today in the same sentence, I think most of our automatic reaction is that they are diametrically opposed, good versus evil. And it's often so easy to overlook their real angelic history. What you could
A good friend of mine recommended tracking down Wendy Alec, author of Chronicle of Brothers. It was time to see how the myths could be woven into modern stories, and to see if whether or not these characters of Lucifer and Michael could actually have been brothers in the truest sense of the word. Wendy, as a novelist, you're in a unique position to speculate and romanticize about historical characters. What was the original appeal of working on a story about Archangel Michael and Lucifer?
So early on in the writing process, I had already decided that probably the most fascinating fantasy storyline would not only be to portray Michael, Gabriel, and Lucifer as three chief princes and as three archangels, for which there seemed to me to be very compelling evidence, but I decided that I would make them brothers. So the overriding challenge and appeal for me, especially in the first book, was the portrayal of the intensity and the complex emotional relationship, especially between Michael and Lucifer, in what took on a whole life of its own. If you research Lucifer's origins, the majority of scholars concur that Satan, in the beginning, before he fell, was actually, and I did find this absolutely fascinating, he was of the highest rank, of the highest class of angels. He was described, Lucifer, in the beginning days as being full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. I mean, it's like mind-blowing to think that now, you know, he's Satan today, but that's who he was then. And it even seemed that his high rank was very closely related to the throne of God.
Wendy, in your heart of hearts, do you believe that Lucifer and Michael are brothers?
Well, you know, as epic as the concepts of brotherhood between Michael and Lucifer is, if you look according to the ancient texts of Christian scripture, I have actually found no sound biblical basis to believe that Michael and Lucifer were actually brothers. Were they both chief princes? Yes, probably could have been. Was Michael archangel and Lucifer covering cherub? Yes. Did Michael and Lucifer have a dispute about the body of Moses? Will Michael and Lucifer wage war in heaven in the very end of days? Yes. But you know, as to irrefutable evidence that they were brothers, for myself, I find that there is none. But do I consider it possible, even though there's no scriptural evidence in the ancient text, that they could have been brothers? Well, you know, as with so many things, only eternity will really unveil the truth.
I felt good, and I felt like we were moving closer to an understanding of this relationship. Yet through it all, I still had one lingering question in my gut, something which I just had to ask. What if both Archangel Michael and Lucifer could speak? What would they say to one another? If I had a chance of solving this mystery for the ages, I needed to speak with the one person who had also come to a similar conclusion.
Was first miffed when God created.
Lucifer and Michael must have exchanged words.
Lucifer says he's free. And Michael says, for a number of reasons, I don't think so. Ever since you rebelled, all you've been doing has been working against God's plan. If you're free, you should be able to do a good act just to show me. Come on, do it. And Lucifer said, I haven't got time for this. I've been planning money. He said, you can't. He said, so you're not really free. You think we're enslaved to God's will. You're enslaved to your mission. You're not free, you know. And that was the first big insight that Michael had. He wasn't free. So what's motivating him, you see? And then he sees it's all this hatred and unrequited narcissism.
That man is Raymond Dennehy, author of Soldier Boy,
He was
The
looking
war between Michael and Lucifer.
In your book, Soldier Boy, you use an interesting literary conceit. You have Lucifer and Michael in dialogue. What could you accomplish with dialogue that you couldn't have accomplished with the usual nonfiction form?
Well, one of the problems is if you deal with angels as in their natural state as pure spirits,
Right.
there's nothing to describe as you would in a novel. You can't say she was a raven-haired beauty, or he lighted a cigarette, or drove away in his car. So what are you going to do? You have conversation.
Traditionally, there's been a belief that Lucifer has the capacity to actually embody a human being as part of his plan for conquest.
Yeah.
This is part of the long mythology of Lucifer.
The Antichrist.
What do you think about that? Did it play into your novel?
I thought about it. At one point, I was going to have a section where each came down as an embodied human being, and you wouldn't be able to tell who was who for a while, for a long time. God wanted beings in as close to his own image and likeness as possible, and that would mean these beings have to be intellectual beings, and they must be free. But when you make beings who have free will, you are accepting the possibility that they may choose evil instead of good. Otherwise, it would not be free will. The thing about understanding Satan, number one, is understanding the evolution of evil. People do things that we find despicable. And yet, as Augustine said when he saw the murderer going to the gallows, there but for the grace of God go I.
Then in the end, does it really matter, ultimately, if Lucifer and Michael were literal brothers? If they are symbolic, figurative brothers, are we, in a sense, rehearsing what happens in our own lives every time we see a reenactment of this story?
Well, I don't know if Michael or Lucifer would use the term brothers themselves, but I think it is helpful for us. I think this kind of way of looking at this situation might ask ourselves, well, what do we do in our own lives, and how do we make choices, and how do we interact with others? How do we see other people?
Regardless if it's literally true or not that Lucifer and the Archangel Michael are related, their relationship offers up a mirror to the timeless struggle between brothers. Their tale continues to provoke and inspire hope and courage that we too may be able to heal the rifts and the wounds in our own intimate lives.